know, Jason Dodier. I'm the co-founder of the Grain Ecosystem. This is part of our regular webinar programming, and we've got a really intriguing discussion planned for today. And this is especially timely if you've tuned into some of our past talks, and as we've traveled across the country, as you look at food, ag, and industrial supply chains, leaders are being pushed to move faster on sustainability while margins are tight, markets are volatile, and rules are evolving. What was once framed as a moral or branding exercise is now a core operating question: where to act, where not to, and how to make decisions that hold up economically. Maisie Ganzler brings rare lived experience to this challenge. Her decade at Bon Appétit Management Company, she has helped build one of the most rigorous sustainability programs in the food industry. Not as marketing or compliance, but as decision-making infrastructure embedded into sourcing, supplier engagement, risk management, and daily operations. Through partnerships with institutions like Google, LinkedIn, Purdue, she has shaped how major employers and campuses think about sustainable food systems while also pushing upstream change with suppliers such as Tyson Foods by creating real market demand for higher standards. What sets Maisie apart is her fluency in real trade-offs, where sustainability creates advantages, where it adds costs, and where it fails if it isn't tied to governance, incentives, and operational reality. For leaders feeling overwhelmed by climate expectations, this conversation is going to offer a practical, grounded lens on how to align impact with business value without overcommitting, fragmenting efforts, or losing credibility. And by the way, if you haven't checked out her book, How to Market Manure at Lunchtime, absolutely phenomenal read. So I want to introduce Maisie Ganzler. Maisie, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll start to dive in on some of the content, as we've got a lot of really ripe things to handle. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jason. That was a fantastic intro. I appreciate everybody being here this morning. I spent 30 years as Chief Strategy and Brand Officer at Bon Appetit Management Company, which is a B2B company offering full food service and cafe services to corporations, private colleges and universities, and what we called specialty venues, which are mainly museums and sports stadiums. And while the company was founded in 1987 around the idea of bringing restaurant quality food into the institutional marketplace, in 2004, we decided to take sustainability as our go-to-market strategy. And we can talk about that evolution, but it led me on an odyssey around tying brand to action to financial results, all around sustainability, which I think is usually thought of as a cost, not as a business driver. So with that experience, as Jason said, I wrote a book, You Can't Market Manure at Lunchtime, and other lessons from the food industry for creating a more sustainable business. And I hope it's a practical how-to guide for other companies. And I think we're going to get into a lot of what's in that book here today. So let's start talking.
I appreciate that. And yes, having read the book and understanding that, first of all, a lot of our audience is looking for great stories to help make things relatable. And clearly, a lot of this has shifted to more of a balance sheet focus, to your point. It's not just about the elements around traditional ESG and sustainability. In the book, you wrote that some sustainability efforts do real good, but don't create competitive advantage, while others look good, but don't change much. What's the simplest framework that leaders can use to choose battles that deliver both real impact and business value, Maisie?
Yeah, well, I'll give examples on both. So the title of the book, You Can't Market Manure at Lunchtime, comes from an experience I had where my boss, our CEO and founder, Fidel Baccio, had gotten really excited about manure lagoons. And this crowd that is no pun intended, knee deep in sustainability and the ugliness of waste might also be excited about manure lagoons. But I got to tell you, most of the public is not. So he was hot on this initiative around changing the way manure is handled in pork. And I was excited about it too. But then in the back of my head, I thought, you can't market manure at lunchtime. And fundamentally, we're making lunch. We're a food company. So in that case, it was a great thing to do from a sustainability perspective, but was going to be hard to get business value with our customers. You can't really, when you sell somebody a BLT, say, here's your sandwich, and the poop was well handled. That's a tough sell. It's not a real appetizing message. Conversely, something that looks good but may not create real value is, as I see it, the rush that we had several years ago towards compostable packaging. Everybody wanted their packaging to be compostable. All of our customers wanted the disposables in the cafe to be compostable. But those of us who have really dug into that issue know that it's actually really hard to compost those disposables and to compost those packaging. While much of it may be technically compostable, many municipalities don't actually accept those bioplastics and they're not home compostable. So, as a company, as a business, you're paying more for the product, but you're not actually creating an environmental benefit. And so, that I would say is a losing proposition as well. The sweet spot and the really hard one to find is the thing that makes real environmental or social change and resonates with your customers.
And just for I'm sure many of our audience has familiarity, but these manure lagoons are essentially open air methane machines and unmanaged emission systems hiding in plain sight from what I've observed. And you're absolutely, it's one of the reasons it caught me when I was in the bookstore here in New York City and saw the book. I was like, wow, I just came back from traveling, and the messaging is so clear. When you see it live, really shifts the narrative, and people now are more aware than ever. And they're making conscientious decisions around the food that they're getting for a lot of reasons. I think we've seen this big pivot and shift around wanting to understand where is that food actually coming from. And then there's the brand equity element. We're tying into that now. You covered many different brands in the book. Certainly, Ben and Jerry's is one of them. My co-founder Ryan, a huge fan of Ben and Jerry's. Obviously, I'm from New England. We love Ben and Jerry's. When you think about companies that maybe don't yet have that brand equity, and there's a lot of them that we're working with, they're in somebody else's supply chain, they're looking to build their own brand. Is it better to go deep on an issue like waste or climate, or risk dilution by tackling many at once? How do you advise these companies? And again, regardless of their current scope and scale.
Yeah. Well, I think that you can go either way. An example is a Ben and Jerry's, as you raised, which has actually gone pretty wide when it comes to sustainability. They have a broad mandate. So they're doing everything from fair trade ingredients to um, to actually flavors that go to specific causes. Um, and in order to do wide, like a Ben and Jerry's or a Whole Foods is another company that went wide. They do environmental, they do social, they do humane treatment. You have to do a lot of things really well, or else you've got this laundry list of seemingly disparate actions that don't really add up. So wide is possible, but it's hard to be known as generally sustainable. And you have a lot of open flanks. So you may be doing great on four things, but the fifth thing people can say, well, you say you're sustainable, but you're not actually dealing with the humane treatment of farm animals. Deep is the other option. If you look at like an Impossible Burger, they went deep. They were focused purely on the idea that the greatest thing that we can do as individuals to stem climate change is to eat less beef. So they wanted to replace beef purely from a climate change perspective. A very deep one issue company. And that means that you have to be the best at that. So whatever you're the deepest on, you need to be the best at. In terms of choosing which you're going to do, I think you need to look at your competitive landscape. One exercise, I do seminars for companies, kind of behind the scenes trainings, and one of the exercises that I ask them to do is to have the lowest ranking person on your team, the newest person on your team, to create a matrix looking at what's publicly available about your sustainability commitments and your customers' sustainability commitments. And why it has to be that lowest ranking or newest person is because if you do it as the director of sustainability or as the founder or as the business operator, you know every little intricacy about what you do, and you populate your part of the matrix about your company with all the nitty-gritty details, and you wind up looking really good against your competitors. But if you ask somebody that knows less about your company, that is only dealing with what's publicly available, then you're comparing apples to apples. What's publicly available about you and publicly available about your competitors. So you take that matrix and you see how you line up, and then you can really have an informed conversation about wide versus deep. Are you going deeper on one issue than anybody else? Or is there a general story that you can tell where you are hitting every aspect of sustainability where your competitors have just one or two initiatives?
So if I'm hearing you correctly, couple things I guess I would take away from that. This is really insightful stuff. Depth matters, but scale changes outcomes. So sustainability in many cases can only move the needle when it goes wide, because the biggest gains come not from potentially perfecting one site, but almost like upgrading the overarching OS or operating system. This is going to feed in obviously to the next question I want to ask you, because really
Well,
as you bridge out from that, it's the partnerships. Go ahead, Maisie.
well, I think, just using the operating system example that you gave, I think one example, if you look at operating systems, like if you look at iOS versus Android, one of the things that Apple has gone deep on is privacy. If you want privacy as a user, iOS is absolutely your choice. They've gone really deep on that, where I'd say Android has gone wide on inexpensive, open, you know, they're two different approaches. And I think both are valid. Do you want to be Apple or do you want to be Android? I'd take being either Apple or Google, right? Successful in both cases.
That's it. That's a really Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's how we should be thinking about things. There's no question about it, ultimately. And that's what moves markets. And that's what gets people engaged, is the power of the thought process and the collective whole. And I really love what you said about, first of all, I'm a big fan of seminars, the right kind of seminars. We all have limited resources and capabilities, but if you can help turn scattered information into a clear matrix where the highest leverage insight can be pulled and you leverage folks in the organization. I feel like a lot of times things get centralized and pulled from the top. And I really also like that approach. Really quickly, I want to flag one thing for the audience. Don't forget, enter your Q&A questions in the box. So if you have questions, there's a Q&A section. Please put those in there. I will start to be weaving those into the dialogue as we typically do. I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions that you want to ask, definitely put those in there, and we will be sure to weave those in appropriately. Now, where I see this going is obviously, and you look at an Apple as an example, these companies have massive supply chains. They have incredible partnerships. There's something along the lines of finding the right partner. It's absolutely mission critical. You talk in the book about EDF, and you provided some really nice insights on the importance of finding your EDF, a partner that brings credibility, science, and momentum. What should companies look for in that partner? And what mistakes do they commonly make when choosing one? And for our audience here, a lot of these folks, Maisie, are looking for biochar off-takers. They're looking for technology partners. They're looking for EPC partners. So there's a lot of different lenses here. So intrigued and excited to get your thoughts on that question.
Yeah. So two different kinds of partners that you alluded to. When we talk about EDF, that's Environmental Defense Fund, and so that's an NGO or an activist partner. And the traditional feeling on the business side when the activists come a knocking is to not be home, right? To lock that door and say, no, no, we're all fine here, leave us alone. But I would argue it. I had a chapter in the book that I called, and then I wound up changing the name of it. But I was going to call it Keep Your Friends Close and Your Enemies. Wait, you don't have any enemies. Because I think that what we have traditionally perceived as people who are threats to our business, in my world, the animal activists, the Greenpeaces, the PETAs, that have really done this big corporate action are to be kept at an arm's distance if or further if you can. And I would argue that they can actually be your best partners, and in a few ways. One is that they are steeped in these issues. We partnered very closely with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program. I didn't have a single marine scientist on my team, but Seafood Watch had 30. And so anytime I had a question, I just call them up and I get free consulting. When I wanted to rewrite our antibiotics policy for meat production, I called the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins. And there's people with PhDs on this stuff that are studying it all the time that are so excited to get to put together a real world policy. So it's free consulting in terms of knowledge base and emerging science. They're also the ones that are thinking about this stuff 24/7 and often pushing the agenda. So they know not just what the hot button issue today is, but what the thing coming up next is. I would often say to the Humane Society, okay, you're asking me to do X, but what do you wish I would do? What is nobody doing yet? When you finish this campaign, what's your next campaign? What's the next issue you're taking on? And if you want to create business advantage through sustainability, you have to be doing the next, not just the thing that's being asked of you today, but what's going to be asked of you tomorrow. So you've got those two, that they are free consultants, they're your prognosticators about the future. And the third is that when you do forge that partnership and you do wow them, nobody is going to give you more third party credibility than an activist organization that's perceived by the public as being truly independent and maybe even anti corporation. So when we were able to make an announcement about moving away from plastic straws with a supporting quote in our press release from Greenpeace, that holds a lot more weight with the public than just a corporate talking head saying what I'm doing is great. So those are the kind of activist NGO partners. The other partners you talked about are supply chain partners, other companies. And with that, I think you need to find a partner that has the same appetite for risk that you do and shares the same values that you do. You mentioned that we worked with Tyson and Purdue, and I would say those two companies are very different culturally. They both raise chickens and a lot of chickens, but they're very different culturally. Possibly because Purdue is still family held and Tyson is a public company, so they have a different view on risk and on time horizon. Um, we all know public companies have a lot of pressure on quarterly results, where a privately held company can often have a longer time horizon and invest in things that are a slower burn. I think just the personalities of the leaders very different. The place where they're headquartered, very different. And ultimately, for us, Purdue was a better cultural fit than Tyson. And you've got to, I think, if you're going to have a major supplier and a major partnership, I really, really urge people I mentioned where their headquarters are, to get out there and meet the people in person. So much of what we do today is done. Like today it's fantastic to be able to do something over Zoom and to reach a lot of people in their offices or in their homes. I'm at home and I'm getting to talk to all of you around the country or around the world. But if you're talking about a real partnership, get out of your office and go to where the people are, break bread together, walk their facility, get to know them, and you'll know pretty quickly who is going to be a good partner in the good times and more importantly in the bad, who's going to really be in the trenches with you or in the manure lagoons.
And it really informs the roadmap for products, decision making. You actually understand what is happening in those things, and you identify blind spots and false confidence together and jointly. And I think culture culture determines how decisions actually get made. And we're in this environment right now, especially in the biochar community of execution, commissioning. The market, as we know, doesn't reward intent, it rewards outcomes. So a lot of investors that are looking at this space, Maisie, they're looking for developers to execute that pilot facility, get off the ground, get that right partnership in place, show that they've got an offtake agreement with, a Purdue or a Tyson's or a Cargill, what have you. The other thing, just to go back to what you said at the beginning, is activism has clearly been on the rise in the US. I was really fortunate. On Monday, I got to speak at the New York Stock Exchange, had a lot of interesting dialogues. But when companies do engage meaningfully, advocacy and issue focused partners do help translate, to your point, complex societal expectations into clearer standards and stronger stakeholder alignment, and ultimately durable operational decisions, not just reactive PR. And I think that's a really powerful piece of what you said. I don't ever, and I listen to a lot of content, podcasts, etc. You don't hear about that a lot. It's really more people will look to paint a negative externality or picture versus what the positives could be, and then you get access to these really smart people that help you to uncover these opportunities jointly, and it leads into kind of the whole thematic of making sustainability felt, not explained. I think we've had to do a lot of explaining where it's really we need to feel it, we need to see it. It's really this customer psychology element. You have often said that guests didn't typically want details. They wanted assurance when you would have discussions with different stakeholders. And when you think about the companies that are engaging in this market, how can they communicate sustainability in a way that creates emotional connection and trust without overwhelming customers or sounding performative? We want to go, look at John Doerr's work and others about objectives and key results and other elements. It's become so rigorous and lacks some of that malleability. Can you share a little bit more about that overwhelming psychology as it relates to these dialogues and work being done around communication?
Yeah. When we started talking about sustainability publicly, as I said in 2004, we were in a good position in terms of we had already done a bunch of stuff and then we decided to make a brochure about it, as opposed to sustainability's hot, what can we claim? We already had actions. So that was great, but we were really in love with the details. And I put out a lot of really dense marketing that I'm sure, well, nobody read it, so it wasn't brutal to read. But if anybody had, um, and part of the problem was that I felt like our customers didn't understand the issues. And so I had to explain the entire issue before I got to the part about what we were doing. And I internally called it the sky is falling message, where it was like, there's all these horrible things going on in the world, right?
Chicken
There's
little.
slavery in your supply chain, and the beef that you're eating is causing climate change, which is causing floods and famine and all this horrible stuff. And then, oh, by the way, we're not doing that. And especially at lunchtime, people don't want all of that heavy, negative, detailed information. What I wound up doing that was much more successful was a campaign called You're Already Doing Something Good. And it put action in the customer's perspective. They were doing something good. and they could feel about it positive. So it wasn't the emphasis on us, it was on them. And the thing that they were already doing that was good was coming into our cafe. Just by coming into our cafe and eating with us, here's the list of all the great things you're doing. You're supporting local farming, you're reducing climate risk, you're supporting fair, good paying jobs. All this list of good things that they were doing. It created a much more positive and emotional, as you said, connection. Now, the caveat to that is you have to have all that nuts and bolts and numbers to back up those claims. So, somewhere, not in the brochure, not in the table tent, but probably on your website, you need to have the ability for customers who really care to drill down and see that those claims you're making are real. Uh, I always loved I mentioned the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program was a great partner of ours for decades. And I loved that they put out a pocket guide. So just a little piece of paper this big that listed the seafood that was best choice, good alternative, and avoid with a simple green, yellow, and red stoplight system. So super basic information, right? I can look at this. I don't have to understand science at all. And I know that green is good and I know that red is bad. But if I want more information, there's a website that has a paragraph about each of those choices and why it's in red, why it's in yellow, why it's in green. And if I click one more time, so I haven't put that much effort in, I've just done a couple clicks, I now get a full scientific report that backs up exactly why that decision was made on red, yellow, green. So it gives everybody the level of knowledge they want. I just want to know the top line, or I want to know every nitty-gritty detail. And I think that's something that we can all strive for in our sustainability materials.
Yeah, and a lot of times big vision gets attention, but real progress comes from being in love with the details. That's where ideas either break or become real. When I was living in the Middle East and I was working on Schneider Electric's Access to Energy program, I really enjoyed, at the time they had put together something called the Planet and Society Barometer, and I really loved it because it was attached to real outcomes.
Mm.
I was seeing it firsthand. So to your point also of, again, being on the ground, being engaged, being in communities. I think that's a differentiator. You talk about a lot of these stories in your book that
Well,
I,
when you
yeah,
say a planet and society barometer, what I assume that is a physical, visual representation of a lot of different information, right? If you think of a barometer, I assume that it was some kind of a gauge and that people could, at a glance, see you're making progress or you're not making progress, good, bad. And then those who want the details have an ability to dive down and understand the numerics behind it, what the algorithm is. You need both.
yeah. And what was cool about that was there were live thought groups from the people that were actually on the ground doing the work, videos, images. So yeah, you could get. That's the cool thing about some of these leading companies. They have the data sets and they're more than happy to share it and go deeper. In many cases, they want to. They've created these
Yes.
departments and teams to do just that. And as you get more engagement, people that want to do it, it's really exciting, and it's you have these different tools that you can bring in to make it a little bit easier to engage. And certainly, a lot of companies today have also tied overarching mechanisms like restricted stock and compensation to those broader strategies within the business. But for me, that was very meaningful. I think that's I attribute that to one of the things that hooked me into the space was seeing what you can do live on the ground and not just having word salad related to sustainability and not having it really clear for people to understand. And actually, from an operating discipline perspective, because that's really what it was. It was execution and operating discipline. Maisie, can you one of the tools that stood out to me, just building on kind of our earlier brief remarks on the matrix, if you could talk a little bit about the circle of responsibility matrix, and particularly how you saw that tying sustainability into governance, not guilt. I mean, at the executive level, I'm always interested in, as well at the executive level, how does a tool like that change behavior and prevent sustainability from fading in two cases, both outside of the kickoff, because you have these great sessions, everybody's around the table, it's all exciting, and then we know what happens after. And then even when you have shifts at a state or federal level to keep things going. So could you just briefly maybe touch on those operating rigors and disciplines, and in particular, the circle of responsibility matrix?
Yeah, so I love a matrix. I love putting things in buckets. I like to find pattern and use fancy tools like really basic Excel spreadsheets or Google Docs to track everything. You don't need a fancy sustainability tracking program. So I mentioned the one matrix, which is that competitive matrix that we create with the lowest ranking employee or the newest employee doing that. The circle of responsibility matrix, circle of responsibility was our internal name for our sustainability program. We shortened it to, it became CORE, just COR. It was created as an external facing brand. And to the point earlier about what a customer wants to hear, it turns out a customer doesn't want to know about the circle of responsibility because they feel, as I heard loud and clear, that that gives them responsibility and they have enough responsibility. So it wasn't a good external facing brand, but it
Mm,
stuck internally. So
okay.
um, I love that real simple red, yellow, green system. Circle of Responsibility Matrix has three sections. Green are all of the initiatives that you have made public commitments around. Yellow are the initiatives that you are in progress on. And red are the initiatives that you are stuck on or want to get to someday. We even had a crazy purple list, which was like the things that you couldn't even begin to imagine how to do, but the crazy ideas you wanted to capture. And the first thing about it is that you're just capturing information. It's easy to have conversations and to brainstorm, but do you have a place to capture the ideas so that you can easily come back to them again and again? And you talk about governance. So whatever your rhythm is for your executive committee meeting and your meeting with your top leadership, if it's weekly or monthly or quarterly, you pull out that circle of responsibility matrix and you go through every category. So the greens, again, the ones that you've publicly made commitments about, are you still green on them? Are you still meeting them? You mentioned changing regulations, right? Is what you're doing still in line with regulations?
Mm,
Is what you're doing still innovative, or are your customer or your competitors all doing it now? So is that green list still true, still relevant, and still impressive? Then you move to the yellow list, the things that you're in progress on. Why are you stuck on them? Is anybody moving faster than you? Is there an example from another industry that's doing something similar that's had a breakthrough? And if you pull it off, if you can get that yellow initiative into green, is it going to create competitive advantage? So should you still be working on it? And then your red list, the things that you're stuck on, or your wild purples, are they possible now? Many of the same questions as from yellow. Are they possible now? If you pulled it off, would it create market advantage? Has anybody in your industry or another industry taken action that you can be inspired from or copy, right? Now, you'd think that you want your green list to be your longest list, your public commitments. And yes, you want a great green list, but you need that yellow and that red to be long as well. You need to be actively working on many fronts so you can continue to feed that green. I get a fair number of questions now about, in the US in particular, the tide has turned politically, and there isn't as much focus at a federal level on, if we just broadly use the word sustainability, right? So, should you abandon your efforts? Well, obviously, you're going to know that I'm going to say no. But one of the many reasons that you shouldn't abandon those efforts is that all of us who are in this work know that those yellows and those reds take a long time. It's years often to get something out of red into yellow, out of yellow into green. And if you abandon those efforts now, if you stop working on those tough questions, the political pendulum is going to swing back, whether it's the midterms or if it's with our next president or the one after that. If you look at history, the pendulum goes back and forth. It's gonna swing back. And if you haven't been actively working on those yellows and reds, you're gonna get caught with your pants down. You are not going to have competitive advantage when regulation comes back around. And I wouldn't say when customers come back around because I don't think customers have actually changed their mind necessarily. Those who were true believers are still true believers, regardless of federal policy. So keep those yellow and those red lists active and pull them out at every single meeting. And even though it may feel redundant, we for years, farm workers sat in the red. I knew terrible things were happening. I had no idea what to do about it. But if you keep talking about it, you keep the desire fresh. When you've got an idea, you pounce on it because you think, I've been talking about this every month for 2 years and I haven't been able to do anything. Here's one glimmer of an idea. Let's give it a shot. Let's move a red into a yellow.
I have so I have so much to say on this particular topic. It's one that introspectively I've spent a lot of time on because to me, in the world we're living in right now, especially with AI, LLMs, language models, only embedded infrastructure grade decarbonization enables scale. And you definitely, to your point, you definitely don't make decisions based on the stroke of a pen. I see it as AI turns things like carbon and waste streams into a binding constraint on growth. Solutions like whether it's biochar or carbon removal systems become enabling infrastructure, Maisie, because you need to be able to reduce regulatory risk, lower the cost of capital, and allow energy intensive assets to scale. And this is certainly one of the key ways that you're going to be able to do that because we are going to be in this country, we're going to be deploying a lot of natural gas and diesel generators. And you've got these big hyperscalers that are making up such a large percentage of our GDP. And they're going to need, they're going to have serious constraints. And then as you and I know better than anybody, when you're implementing these processes, it's just good for business. The economic returns are good, but the communities benefit. And I know you and I have seen a lot of these dairies and algae blooms, and certainly I've seen soil erosion and aquaculture, aquifer drainage, and things that are just very, very disturbing. But I think that, and this will feed into the next question. I mean, we are having more tough conversations than we ever had to try to ensure that we don't lose track of reality and we stay rooted and grounded in what's best for society. And one of my go-to things is you never have to compromise respect to be decisive, kind of going back to what you were saying, we need to have mutual respect. I think one of the things I've loved about biochar at the regulatory level is it's one of the few places where I've seen really nice respect between members of Congress and Senate on both sides, whether they've been farmers or industrial engineers or they're just, looking out for their constituents. They tend to be very well grounded. And as you and I know, farmers don't just want, and companies, they don't just want a handout subsidy. They want to actually be producing value. My last thing on this for now would be, it was a saying I heard from our leader in North America at Schneider. He would always say, be kind on the people and tough on the problem. And you enable that by having these working documents that you sign off on. And you continue to say, hey, remember this. We were here. We were at yellow or we were at green or purple. And I think that it's really intriguing how you flagged it because it's competitive advantage isn't eliminating the yellow. It's converting it to green faster than others and owning that risk early and engineering constraint into capability. And to me, the winners don't hide exposure. They for lack of a better term, I think they turn what slows others down into operational advantages the market can't necessarily see. So you're just, I'm loving this talk because you're making me think so much myself. Like I have so many introspective thoughts as we're going. Sticking on the tough conversations, because this is a big one. We all have to have these. I'm going to go back. I call it the big chicken moment from your book, kind of around Purdue. You know, your experience, and I think almost everybody in this chat has a familiarity in one way or another with Purdue. It shows the power of radical listening. What advice do you have for the leaders in this room and others that are traditionally in criticized industries who want to engage in an honest way without becoming defensive or being labeled as greenwashing? And if you could use some of those examples from the book at a high level around the Purdue, I think that would be really helpful for the group.
Yeah, well, in the book, I got to interview 12 sustainability pioneers, and some of them were from obvious companies like Ben and Jerry's or Whole Foods or Stonyfield Organic Yogurt. But then I also interviewed Jim Purdue from Purdue Chicken, which might not be seen as necessarily a sustainability pioneer to those of you who aren't steeped in the chicken business. But Jim Purdue has done a lot, and um, one of the most interesting parts of the conversation to me is that there was a New York Times expose about a Purdue farmer. So Nicholas Kristof actually wrote a piece about the abuses of chickens on a Purdue farm. Those of us, well, in any business, what is a worse PR nightmare than the New York Times covering something horrible in your supply chain and Nicholas Kristof picking it up, right? That's pretty awful.
Yeah.
So I had assumed that that was a watershed moment in the Purdue arc towards better treatment of chickens. And I went into the conversation with Jim with that assumption. He actually said no. You mentioned defensiveness. What he did, he told me a story of when his head of live operations came to him and said, "Hey, there's this piece in the New York Times and with them with Mercy for Animals, and here's what was happening on the farm." And Jim said to Randy, who was head of live operation at the time, "Did we know that was happening at the farm? Did we know the chickens were being treated like that?" And he said, "No." And Jim's response was, "Well, we should thank them then." And that's a pretty non-defensive stance, right? We should thank them then. Um, but anyway, I thought that was going to be like the big aha moment. It turns out that Jim looks at all of the customer comments that come into Purdue. Um, and I have had a similar experience. If you emailed info@bamco.com, you got me. You got somebody else first that would answer if you were just looking for a general question on the company, a mailing address, and I didn't respond, but I saw every single one of those emails. So when I woke up in the morning and, I'm that pathetic person that so many of us are, sleep with my phone next to my bed, I would wake up, pick up the phone, and immediately see every single email that went to our information general mailbox. And Jim Purdue also got every single customer complaint, probably not one by one as I did, probably in a consolidated piece. But that's that active listening that you talk about. And you want to hear from everybody, especially your critics, and maybe even thank them.
Yeah, I think positive feedback isn't noise. First of all, it's data about what's working, but then criticism essentially tells you where to fix, where to lean in, and it's really like that's so profound. I love the fact that you were personally engaging and looking at that. When I read that section of the book, particularly about Purdue, it was eye opening because a lot of times you feel like, oh, there's no merit potentially in what I'm sending. Usually, if you send it and it's thoughtfully done, you are going to get somewhere. And I think that is something that, and then you get wisdom of the crowds too. And it's why I love sessions like this. I'm going to go to some Q&A in a minute because it's filling up, and we want to hear from the folks that are here that are doing the great work. But I think ultimately I would summarize that where criticism tells you where to fix, praise tells you where to double down. But don't forget that kind of messy middle. And sometimes that kind of gets lost in the fold of where things are. But there are, just for the group to know, there are many stories like that in the book that you can check out. Now, I am going to go to a couple questions, and then we'll come back to our talk here. Maisie, one of the questions that came in the chat, I'm going to try to read these word for word as best I can. What is the most effective form of internal activism you've seen inside a large organization?
Well, internal activism is a tricky one depending on who your leadership is, what your relationship with them is, how many brownie points, to mix metaphors, do you have in the piggy bank? I was never the CEO of my company. I was always the number two, and so I had somebody that I reported to, our founder, Fidel Baccio.
Very
And
passionate guy.
very passionate guy, but as he said many times, we're in California, and he would say, I'm no Berkeley hippie, I'm a Republican. So this was not somebody who founded the company to be more sustainable. This was not Gary Hirschberg, who was a scientist and created a
Mm,
yogurt company to prove an environmental point. This was a guy who went into business because he wanted to make money. And yet he also was very passionate and very excitable in the best of ways. And one of the scariest things I ever said to him, I tell the story in the book, is we were a company that had a dream, not a mission statement, but a dream. And our dream was to be the premier food service company known for its commitment to culinary expertise and excellent customer service. That was how the company was founded. And in 2004, when Fidel wanted to have this go-to-market strategy around sustainability, I said to him, if you want that to be true, we have to rewrite the dream. And so saying to our leader, we have to rewrite the thing that you sat down and put literal pen to paper, because he certainly wasn't typing in 1987, I can tell you. When you founded this company, what your dream was has to change. But he was open to that. So that's one type of a leader and one type of internal activism where you say the scary thing, but he knew that I had the company's best interests at heart. So we had many miles under our belts already at that point. We could have those scary conversations. Now, a different type of internal activism is when you don't have that trust with your leader. They aren't, or they are very risk averse, and they don't fully um, care about these issues. And I wouldn't assume they don't care because they are horrible people, kind of to your point about respecting people. But they don't care because they have problems that they see as more pressing, or they don't fully understand the issues. And so, with that type of internal activism, I think you have to start from an educational standpoint, and not in a lecturing way, and not in a chiding way, and not in a the sky is falling way. But can you create educational opportunities? Can you get them out of their office into the field to see and experience something for themselves? Can you bring in a speaker that is inspirational and business minded? Can you introduce them to the enemy? We did a lot of work on farm workers, as I said, it sat in the red list for a really long time. We didn't know what to do about it. And one of the watershed moments was I brought in Arturo Rodriguez, who was the president of the United Farm Workers at the time, and brought him into the office for Fidel to meet him. And excuse my language, but I think it's part of the story. Fidel walks into the room, and the first thing he says to this man who is married to one of Cesar Chavez's daughters, this man who has dedicated his life to farm workers, the first thing Fidel says to him is, I fucking hate unions. So we're off to a great start, right? But as we sat there and we talked about the commonalities of values and of supporting people, by the end of the meeting, Fidel took Artie's hand in his and he said, "You are a kind and good man." And Artie pinned a UFW pin right into Fidel's lapel. We had had that change because we had gotten away from the adversary into the human. And I had created an opportunity for Fidel to meet the human behind the union, not just the picketing, scary, anti-business union. So if you're going to have that internal activism and you don't have a leader that's already committed, you don't have a lot of trust built, you have to build that trust through education, but in a positive way. And always have your numbers. Always have the numbers and don't pretend that business doesn't matter.
The just the fast things I'll call out, and then I'll go to the next question. But I think it's a misconception. You don't have to be the founder of Patagonia or Paul Pullman or Seth Goldman or Dan Barber to do this kind of work. I think that is a huge takeaway, and a lot of times that's assumed. And then it's really human magic where it can go from there. And the human element is so important. We get so focused in this collective overarching whole, you forget you're dealing with real people. They may work in a union, but there's individuals and they all have different, they come from different backgrounds, they have different learned experiences. And it's critical to sit down, meet, and listen. Really
At
appreciate that.
Compass Group, yeah, sorry, at Compass Group, we had a CEO that when we were acquired by the world's largest food service company, and they were the CEO of North America was in charge of $20 billion worth of business. So he had a lot of entrenched systems and a lot of risk. And he'd been the CFO. He was really a numbers guy, not a food guy. And we had this breakthrough moment on our sustainable seafood policy for all of Compass Group North America, this huge amount of seafood that's being purchased, when I made an offhanded comment about moving the fish in fish and chips from cod to pollock. And Gary is a Brit. And fish and chips is like a fundamental core memory for him. He's not a food guy, but fish and chips, if you come from a certain region in Britain,
It's different.
it hits different. And that got him thinking. And then he wanted to know more. And I wish that I could say that I was smart enough to have thought through what he would care about, but I just dumbed into it. But when you dumb into it, seize on it and run.
Profound and well said. And I think it's those sometimes the more simplistic things that you gloss over that we need to be really mindful of in the moment. And a lot of it in the world we live in today, too, it's being present. I
Yeah.
think that's how I would sum that up is really just be present when you're having a conversation with anybody. Give them that respect that capability and that timing, and then you can get to something that you can actually seize. I'm gonna ask one more quick one from the chat, and then we'll wrap up here because it is incredible, especially talking to someone like you, Maisie, how quickly the time goes by. If leaders take away just one idea today from this talk, especially those feeling squeezed between climate pressure and economic reality, what would you want it to be? And I'll preface this, Maisie. We have probably like 3 questions in the chat of a similar narrative, really related to the financial pressures and the sustainability element. So can you give kind of a rooted answer around that one for the listeners?
Yeah. So if I if you had one takeaway, it would be to reframe sustainability as being a cost to being a business driver and ask yourself, what would be different about my business financially if we were more sustainable or if our customers recognized that we were more sustainable? In the food business, and this goes across pretty much every business, I would say, we think of average check and we think of frequency.
Mm,
Average check, how much is each customer spending with you at every interaction? And frequency, how often are they buying from you? Those are the two things that you can change. I want them to come more often and I want them to spend more when they come, right? Be that at lunch or be that a PO for a large industrial system. Both of those things can be driven by sustainability. So think about that. How can you get people to buy more of your product or pay more for it? And I wouldn't say, please don't hear me say that people will just pay more for sustainability. They won't. Not today. We need price parity. But will they buy more product from you, or will they buy your product more often based on sustainability, based on the feeling they get from it, based on the other advantages they get? Are there functional benefits? Think about how can you drive those two things, not
As
just cost.
Yeah, with check reflecting over time pricing power and then frequency, of course, loyalty. Brand
Yes.
loyalty is big. And I know so many people, they've got their brand and they stick with that no matter what. And you can bake it if it goes up a buck or two. It hardly it falls into they may offset that elsewhere. But once you get into a brand, people tend to stick with that brand. I don't have the stats in front of me, but it's just a casual observation. And certainly in the world we
Absolutely.
live in, pricing, it's a very tough environment right now in terms of just cost structure, and expecting people to absorb different premiums is going to be, it's one of the reasons microgrids were so popular, or have been so popular, is to try to present some elements. Yes, there's resilience, but it's also smoothing out the price curve of and bringing a more predictable nature to pricing overall.
And predictable is such an important word. There was a farmer that I worked with that was selling, I mean, big farmer, multinational, big farmer, not little local guy, that was selling 1% of their berries to Costco. But by digging into the sustainability initiatives that were important to Costco, they got the same price, but a bigger PO from Costco. And Costco for them was a really great customer, consistent, predictable, a good partner, as opposed to some of the other groceries that were more changing with the winds. And so for them, the win on sustainability was getting entrenched into the Costco system. And we all know we have better and worse customers, right? And if you can get entrenched in those good ones, that is worth a lot.
That's the key. You get entrenched with a good customer. It's a lifetime. And then you can do a net present value over the cost of over a period of 15, 20 years versus, there's a lot of churn sometimes with some of these other businesses. So it is well worth it. That goes back to the partner dialogue we had at the beginning.
Yeah.
Maisie, we have just about run our time. What I would ask is, how can our audience stay up to speed on what you're doing? How can they follow you? How can they engage? Obviously, I think I've said it 5 times now, but I'll say it again. As everybody knows, I'm very big on book recommendations and reading different books. And was a fantastic read that I will be reading again. But how can our audience stay in touch with you?
Well, the book, I can tell you, having written a book, the number one thing I want is for it to be useful to people. I got my advance. I'm not going to make any money if you buy the book, so I'm not trying to shill the book from that sense, but it's a quick read. I wrote it so that you could read it on a cross-country flight and that you would have lots of to-dos on a yellow pad at the end of it. So pick up that book, You Can't Market Manure, at Lunchtime. I can be found at maisieganzler.com. Link to me on LinkedIn, but I'm happy to have conversations. So reach out, Maisie at maisieganzler.com.
Maisie, I'm sure you're going to get a lot of outreach. We will be, for all those here, we will be circulating this recording shortly. We'll be providing some notes and quotations. And this was a really unique and differentiated dialogue. And I so appreciate your time. I got a lot out of it, both the book and the discussion. And looking forward to keeping the narrative and the dynamic going, and touring some biochar and some lagoon sites with you this year will be top
Yes.
of the goals. I have plenty, as do you, I'm sure, plenty of sites that I think we can go to together. So, Maisie, wishing you nothing but the best as you continue in this journey. And congratulations on all your success that you've had with the book and your career. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you for the thoughtful questions and the opportunity.
Wishing everybody a great rest of your day ahead. And thank you for being here.